who graduated from Brandeis a year ahead of Allison, 1986. And she majored, of course, not only in American Studies, but had a minor in Women's Studies as well. She earned her PhD from Binghamton University. Robin's research focuses on American women's political activism and social movements, particularly the history of the birth control movement in the 20th century. She has published a book entitled Reproductive Health, Reproductive Rights, Reformers and the Politics of Maternal Welfare, 1917-1940, Ohio State University Press. Her current project examines the impact of the legalization of abortion and second wave feminism, on the birth control movement in the United States in the 1970s. Delighted to welcome back to Brandeis Robin Rosen.
I'm so happy, honored, and intimidated to be here. Oh my gosh, it's like a who's who. And I do want to talk about my research today, and I will. But first, of course, like everybody else, I have to honor Joyce. I want to honor Joyce and the role that she's played in shaping my life and my career. And I really am feeling exceedingly sentimental right now. Ever since I walked on campus last night, it's my 30th reunion. Anyway. But as a historian, I also want to make the case that there's a direct line from my work with Joyce here at Brandeis in the 1980s to my professional work and my current research project. In the fall of 1985, I turned 20 years old, and I let Joyce Antler talk me into writing a senior thesis. She had been my professor in my sophomore year when I took my first women's history class, and this class literally changed the course of my life. I was an American Studies major, and I had come to Brandeis having taken AP US History, and I thought I knew American history pretty well. Yet I hadn't heard of most of the women on Joyce Antler's syllabus that semester. Joyce's class introduced me to women's history and laid bare the problems of bias and exclusions in the curriculum. It catapulted me not only into a women's studies minor and an academic commitment to women's history, but also into political activism. Joyce Antler's class turned me into a feminist, and not because Joyce was ideological or strident or even set out to do this. She merely laid out the evidence. Her class was the first in which I thought, you don't know any of this stuff, and you didn't even know that you didn't know it. That kind of blindness isn't a personal shortcoming, it reflects a structural problem. As feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh once wrote, once you've been given permission to connect the dots in a different way, you see new constellations in the sky. And Joyce's class and Joyce gave me that permission to see the sky in a different way, and I'm forever, forever grateful. So when Joyce convinced me to do a senior thesis, I do remember the discussion we had about possible topics. I was just laughing about this the other day. So this conversation had all the classic generational conflicts of feminism. So Joyce suggested, surprisingly enough, that I write about how women have grappled historically with work-family responsibilities. And I, of course, as a 20-year-old, couldn't have been less interested in that. And I responded to Joyce that I want to write about radical women. After all, I was by then a student radical. I was an activist deeply involved in the Women's Coalition and anti-apartheid activities in the 80s at Brandeis. So the work-life balance seemed really totally boring to me. And of course, 6 years later, as I prepared to defend my dissertation while pregnant with my first child, and for the next 23 years, it seemed like the most important topic in the world. So I should have listened to Joyce, and it seemed, like maybe we could have figured something out back then in the 80s that would have made a difference. But what we settled on was the history of the women's peace movement, the American women's peace movement, and Brandeis gave me an undergraduate research grant. This isn't a new thing. If those of us who work right now at American colleges, it's, undergraduate research. But here it was back in the 80s. I got a research grant to go to Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, where I visited the Peace Archives, and I investigated the papers of the Women's Peace Party, who defined themselves as the mother half of humanity. And I can recall, as a radical 20-year-old being completely aggravated, that they had to couch their radical pacifist message in these traditional gendered terms. And it was the first time, though, I was confronted with the importance of rhetorical strategies in social movements, and here's my connection to what's going on now. But early on, under Joyce's guidance, I learned that radical women often had to find ways to soften their message. Sometimes they had to obfuscate in order to operate. From there in grad school, I turned my attention to the birth control movement, and I argued that birth control needed to be examined in the context of other movements that had similar goals, that is to lower maternal and infant mortality and make motherhood, infancy, and childhood safer and healthier. The rhetorical gymnastics that the birth control movement engaged in were positively astounding at times. Here in Massachusetts, where laws were really most draconian, the women in the Birth Control League of Massachusetts were told that even the name of the organization on their door could get them into trouble, could get them arrested. And so they became the Family Welfare Foundation and distanced themselves from the national movement for at least a decade. And the national birth control movement historically did its own maneuvering. The trajectory of the organization from the 1920s through the 1960s reflected an ever-increasing public acceptance and respectability, slowly but steadily earned over the decades. But just when the organization was hitting its stride, a complex combination of unexpected circumstances threw it off its game. The emergence of second-wave feminism, the legalization of abortion, and the rise of the cultural and political backlash that spurred the culture wars. My current research project seeks to determine how the birth control establishment was affected by these events. This is a story of what happens to an organization, Planned Parenthood, that had been trying to avoid challenging sexual norms when confronted by a movement and a cultural moment that sought to explode them. So by the early 70s, Planned Parenthood, here's a memo, it's a small quote from a memo called Objectives and Activities for the 70s. It reveals a decidedly bright outlook on the future. And here's the quote: "When an organization is small, its cause controversial, and its battles sharp and frequent, it is a small troop against the world. Such was Planned Parenthood until recently, when the rest of the world joined up." So this is how they were feeling in 1970. The rest of the world has joined up. "This has now transformed our struggle." Right? We have won substantial acceptance of our goals, and now we must attain them. Right? So clearly, Planned Parenthood had a sense of itself as peaking in regard to its credibility and reputation, sloughing off any vestiges of controversy and forging ahead into a more receptive period. By the late 1960s, family planning was firmly entrenched in public health. They enjoyed bipartisan support and received millions of dollars in federal funding. Family planning had become so mainstream that in 1972, here's my first slide. In 1972, the U.S. Right? I didn't know this. Okay. The U.S. Postal Service, which had been so ironically instrumental in censoring the birth control movement early on, issued a first-class family planning postage stamp. Okay, so this is a first-class stamp. Historians of the birth control movement, myself included, have shown that this kind of respectability, the respectability of making it onto a first, can you imagine? Oh, it's okay. I'm sure, yeah, the Republican, I won't get into it. Historians of the birth control movement have shown that this kind of respectability was forged through strategies that can only be classified as conscious disengagement with women's rights and feminist perspectives, utilizing rhetoric that emphasized women's health, happy families, healthy babies, wanted children, helped to make the birth control movement acceptable and respectable. I firmly believe that a wanton child is different. It radiates light. Anyway, this is a Margaret Sanger's romanticization of, the wanted child. So the Roe decision in '73 certainly complicated the family planning movement's political position. Legalization of abortion set the opposition into motion and contributed to sweeping changes in the country's political climate. But the challenges to the family planning movement presented by the external environment went beyond the particular politics of abortion. The 70s was a disconcerting era in U.S. history, representing the end of what one historian has called the Great American Ride. A barrage of crises in the form of stagflation, war, terrorism, rising crime rates, rising divorce rates, racial conflict, the energy crisis, and Watergate meant that Americans could no longer count on the economy to keep growing, the military to win wars, the government to be honest and accountable, and their family and their neighborhoods to be secure. In this environment, the liberal domestic political agenda encountered unexpected obstacles as the decade wore on. Many of us remember this. Coming off of victories in civil rights, the passage of ERA, the burgeoning environmental and gay rights movement, it was not only Planned Parenthood that expected the 70s to be a decade in which liberal dreams might just come true. But the progressives did not count on what Jefferson Cowie has called the most significant political transformation in post-war political history, and that is the shift of the white working class towards the right. By the mid-70s, the liberal consensus was shredding, and radicals and conservatives struggled to shape the nation's directions. And we can't understand Planned Parenthood's fate in the 70s if we don't consider this larger cultural context in which it had to operate. Historians of the civil rights movement provide helpful insights for understanding these circumstances, as they too have tried to explore how a decade of civil rights progress was followed by the calamities of busing, the controversies over affirmative action, and the renewal of racial violence in urban America. Andrew Lewis, in his study of SNCC, a student nonviolent court, I don't have to tell you guys that, you all know that, writes that the 1970s marked the end of what he calls the conciliatory language of the American creed, as civil rights activists began to speak in terms of consciousness and power rather than fairness. We certainly see that in the women's movement, as the radical wing rejected the inclusive and liberal language of the National Organization for Women, taking ever more provocative positions. When liberation groups like the Red Stockings asserted that all men oppress women, and Shulamith Firestone claimed that pregnancy is barbaric, Americans were no longer hearing the conciliatory language of creed. Prior to the emergence of second wave, the context within which Planned Parenthood operated successfully in the post-war years revolved around organizations like the Population Council, the Ford Foundation, Population Crisis Committee, and the U.S. Public Health Service. After '68, this context shifted to include disquieting feminist critiques of the family, sexuality, and motherhood. How did the movement's dynamism affect Planned Parenthood? Kathy Nastrom's analysis of the civil rights movement is instructive here. She asks, how did civil rights activists in the 60s grapple with Black power? Well, the fascinating implication of such a question is that Black power militants made civil rights activism harder in some ways. Linda Gordon makes a similar claim about abortion when she writes, quote, one might speculate that had there not been a feminist movement, abortion might have been decriminalized with less opposition. In the 1970s, people feared what the availability of abortion meant. Did women even want to be mothers? Would they kill their babies in order to be liberated? Feminists in the era did not very much to soothe these fears. The era of soothing, consensus-building liberal politics was over as social movements began to confront, provoke, and unsettle. And this had serious consequences for organizations like Planned Parenthood. Thus, ironically, the climate within which Planned Parenthood had learned to operate was clearly complicated by second-wave feminism itself. A fascinating set of oral histories done in '75 and '76 with pioneers in the early abortion rights movement provide a glimpse into this, what I call the PP feminist divide, the Planned Parenthood feminist divide. So here on one hand we have activist, scholar, and singer biographer Ellen Chesler. Many of you know Ellen Chesler. And she was an interviewer in the 70s. And she's interviewing pioneers in the early abortion rights movement, Beatrice Blair and Lana Phelan, two of the founders of NARAL. So at one point, Chesler speculated in this interview whether the National Planned Parenthood people, quote, were too concerned with the scientists being respectable, being a member of that elite community, rather than being activist feminists, you know, involved in the delivery of service rather than the promotion of an ideal. Which is interesting because Planned Parenthood people were the ones providing services, but it just shows you Chesler's idea about Planned Parenthood. And Blair recalled more even-handedly that in the late 60s, quote, things were breaking down as far as the contraception issue was concerned, but abortion was the next thing to be tackled, and some of us were ready for it and some of us weren't. In one of my favorite exchanges, Chesler and Blair speak directly to the relationship between feminists and Planned Parenthood. Chesler states, quote, scratch a feminist and you'll find a Planned Parenthood hater. And Blair answers more thoughtfully, scratch a lot of those Planned Parenthood women and you'll find a feminist. She says, I think this was until the feminist movement started up again, that whole long period of the 50s, that's where feminism was. It was at Planned Parenthood. So neither Chesler nor Blair were completely accurate, because it took a while for Planned Parenthood to establish a unified and clear position on its relationship to the abortion rights movement. My research shows that through the 70s, there was no consensus about how to navigate what had become increasingly treacherous political terrain. The national organization, as well as its affiliates all over the country, faced a dilemma. On one hand, the expansion into abortion provision seemed to some a natural next step for an organization devoted to helping women manage their fertility and their health. However, Planned Parenthood also had a lot to lose, and stepping into the abortion controversy seemed to some a bad bet, a distraction from rather than a deepening of its core mission. So I interviewed this man named Stephen White, who had been the clinical director of Planned Parenthood in Kansas City, Missouri in the 70s, and this is what he says. We weren't doing abortions or advocating for abortions. When I left in 1974, we were not doing abortions. There were no discussions or debates about performing abortions. My memory is that Roe changed absolutely nothing. We were a birth control clinic. I assume we all supported abortion. I would not be surprised if my perspective replicated pretty much the perspective of all of us in Planned Parenthood. Oh, John, one more minute? Okay, so for White, personal support for abortion did not translate into organizational support. And so the other example I give is of a clinic up in Syracuse, New York, who actually started doing abortion before Roe. And so what I'm trying to argue is that while reticent and cautious in some places, in other places Planned Parenthood was way ahead of the curve. So the last point I want to make is that Roe's challenges went deeper than a logistical question of what to do next. Taking a long view of Planned Parenthood's history, we can see that its very identity and reputation suffered disruption. Historians like Gillian Frank and Natasha Zaretsky have shown that emerging right-wing discourse in the 70s often cast feminists as culprits and families and children as imperiled. Everybody here knows who that is. Save Our Children, if you recall, was the name of Anita Bryant's organization. I argue that this rhetorical tactic critically undermined the consensus that it had been developing around family planning, and that this is a blow that the movement has yet to recover from. Frank's work on Anita Bryant and the attempt of her organization Save Our Children to fight busing, ERA, and gay rights shows that their central argument revolved around protection of children, to keep them from scary neighborhoods and dark classmates and negligent feminist mothers and predatory gay male teachers, right? So this is a typical, the Trojan horse of the ERA is filled with abominations, and those abominations are aborting women and daycare centers, Now, okay, so here's my central point, and then I promise I'll sit down. The new right had hit on a strategy that seemed to work. And what fascinates me about this tactic in particular is that the birth control movement historically had also attempted to adopt the child in peril argument, right? So when they talk about this, right, every child a wanted child, Planned Parenthood saves lives, saves homes, showing pictures of happy families, right? To me, the interesting question in the 70s is who gets to appropriate this rhetoric, right? Which side can now claim credibly the label of child protector or protector of the family in peril? Is it the reproductive rights activists, or is it the new right, right? So this is part of this brand new context. So in conclusion, eschewing arguments for both bodily integrity and sexual freedom, the birth control movement had forged ahead 30s through the 60s by pitching this sanitized rhetoric that worked to its advantage, okay? Even changing the name to Planned Parenthood was a rhetorical strategy. So even when it supported abortion, it fell back on its old tried and true ways. It articulated abortion as a public health crisis, right? So it's constantly talking about health and not women. So we've come full circle from the Women's Peace Party and my problems with their rhetoric to my attempt to understand now the political rhetoric of the history of reproductive health and rights. I do want to leave you with a hopeful historical example of a progressive response to the child in peril argument. In Dade County, Florida, where Anita Bryant was doing her work, gay rights activists attempted to co-opt and disrupt the rhetoric of Save Our Children by answering their charges emphatically. We are your children. Hi, Mom and Dad, they said. That brilliant strategic move on their part shows that there are always opportunities to take back control of the political narrative. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes, I believe, for questions. Sharon has a microphone if anybody would wish to ask questions of any of our panelists.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Marla Bruckner. I loved all the contributions earlier in this debate. Thank you. And I'm going to ask a question that definitely comes from me, but I think is something that I'm inspired by also, and why I so appreciate Joyce's work, particularly not only class, but some of the race questions. Hassia, your work is so important, but we continue to have, under the guise of Jewish women's history, especially in the United States, Ashkenazi or European Jewish women's history that doesn't seem to take into the complexity of who Jewish women are in the United States. And the second paper, as much as I so appreciate your contributions to this literature on Jews and African Americans, you're right, the period that I understand you're writing, I am not a historian, so please correct me, but is absolutely at the crux and the height of the birth of, as you call it, Jews also called ourselves Hebrews and Israelites, of the black Jews and black Hebrew and Israelite movements. And so where are black Jews, Hebrews and Israelites in this, what you are looking at as somewhat dichotomized blacks and Jews as if they're separate communities, which is not at all the reality on the ground. Which again goes to the wonderful last, again, I love them all, so these are constructive questions, they're not meant to, whatever. Again, as I'm sure you're well aware of, abortion and reproductive rights, moving into reproductive justice is not only about, quote unquote, the women of color out there needing reproductive justice, it's the development of, I'd love to hear maybe a few of your favorite tidbits. I was missing a little bit of the Jewish and critical race tidbit or strain in the fantastic presentation that you gave. Because Jewish women and the Jewish community was so at the forefront of all that you're talking about, and I wasn't getting that directly from you, but I know that you know it. And so also understanding that.
Thank you for thinking that.
But also then the development that you're talking about actually also highlighted a tremendous ethnic, class, and racial division amongst Jewish women. So it's not only about Jewish women as if they're all white, and then the reproductive justice movement as women of color. The growing importance of Jews and the Jewish community, Jewish women in the abortion and reproductive rights movement was only made possible by the splitting of Jewish women in terms of class and race, etc. So anyone who wants to say anything about that, thank you.
Well, in a way, your question to me it's obviously an excellent one, and I'd say in this entire historiography, which I tried to compress into, I guess less than 20 minutes, because I also want to talk about Joyce and shopping, is very much predicated on the fact that there's very little in the way of a paper trail or an archival base from which to write a more expanded history. Or do those archives exist to get into what was happening on the ground in the non-Ashkenazi communities? Really? Okay. I could tell you that.
We've had to create the records.
Well, okay, but the records have to be created. Records don't get created, one might say, from the top down. The history we have of archives, particularly of ethnic archives and communal archives, is where people in communities say, we have a history we want it written, not both in the passive, and also we want to write it, and these archives have to be available. And so there is just very little to go on. I think there are some interesting efforts now, but I could say that the first synagogue to give women the right to vote, to be members, was Mikveh Israel, which was a Sephardic congregation, although nearly none of the members were Sephardim. They were by then all Ashkenazim. But it's a history that has to be written, and it will be written when individuals within those communities go about the business of creating archives.
I'll just add to that I completely agree that there should not be the impression of kind of a monolithic relationship, or the relationship of a monolithic group, you know, Jewish Americans with a monolithic group of, you know, African Americans. And in the bigger project, I do try to make the distinctions that other scholars have made before me, that there is a different relationship, there's a different kind of cross-racial relationship between the Central European, the Jews of Central European descent who've been in the United States longer. They lead the anti-defamation campaign, so they get a bigger place in my book. But they don't tell the same story as Eastern European Jews would tell about, you know, some of the same issues. And that Eastern European Jews, I think, have a closer affinity to African Americans. So I see it as a more fragmented story, but it's hard to distill it down. But that's a great point.
I don't know the answer to your questions, but I have a lot of ideas. I'm at the beginning of my project, so I'm deep in the Planned Parenthood archives right now. And I can say that one of the things that I've been challenged on at other conferences when I was giving a version of this paper, you know, I think there's a lot of still sort of propaganda about Planned Parenthood as being, you know, I mean, if you Google Planned Parenthood, you're going to find out that Margaret Sanger's a Nazi, basically. I mean, it's unbelievable how that distortion of the record of Planned Parenthood has been. And, you know, I left out a lot today, but there's a ton in their work. When they were hitting their stride in the late 60s, they wanted to tackle child nutrition and, you know, teenage pregnancy and domestic abuse, and, you know, they had an exceedingly bold agenda for the 70s before something hit the fan, and as I'm trying to describe, you know, when things became derailed. And so there's a lot more to this. And then the second thing I'll say about Jewish women was that when I was reading about the early pioneers in the abortion rights movement, there were actually fewer Jewish women than I was expecting there to be. But I'm going to keep looking, and thank you.
Any other questions?
Only if there's time. Hi, thank you all. Hi, I'm Jody Edgar Levine. As the